Hi guys. Tonight we're having a special setting for our lecture. I'm at my surf camp, so my tent is set up here in the dunes, and I've been surfing all day, and that's why I look like this. And I'll be getting up early in the morning and going surfing all day tomorrow. So we're going to have our Ramachandran Chapter 9 discussion with mosquitoes. And I hope that this lighting is okay. It's not so good for my looks, but hopefully you'll be able to see me. Okay, so let's start with Chapter 9 of Ramachandran. We did the introduction. I'm going to skip directly at Chapter 9, God in the Limbic System. So in Chapter 1, of course, he gives a fairly comprehensive overview of the of neuroanatomy. I mean, I think his introduction to neuroanatomy in Chapter 1 surpasses what we get in our introductory to psychology textbooks. He's really, I would easily use his Chapter 1 in place of, for an intro to psych biology chapter, neuroanatomy chapter. So much of that will be a review, but we're mostly looking at the temporal lobe. So for a religious experience, and I guess it's a good idea to point out that when this book was published, I guess it was in the late 90s, Ramachandran, the popular press, which is typically the case, the popular press took Ramachandran's chapter on temporal lobe epilepsy and the connections between the temporal lobe epilepsy, religious experience, transcendence, and even artistic pursuits. And they started to call this the God, that they found the God spot in the brain, or the God module in the brain. And Ramachandran in the book says no to this. And furthermore, in the foreword and in Chapter 1, in the foreword especially, he specifically says that Chapter 9 is very speculative. This is the one where he's going out the most on the limb of speculation, unlike his earlier chapters, where he discusses phantom limb syndrome, etc. So there is no God spot in the brain. There's no area of the brain where religious experience takes place. This chapter is about temporal lobe, the limbic system, the temporal lobe, and this fascinating correlation between temporal lobe activity, temporal lobe seizures, and religious transcendence, religious experience. I love this opening quote that Ramachandran begins with, Albert Einstein's quote: "It is very difficult to elucidate the cosmic religious feeling to anyone who is entirely without it. The religious geniuses of all ages have been distinguished by this kind of religious feeling, which knows no dogma. In my view, it is the most important function of art and science to awaken this feeling and keep it alive in those who are receptive to it." That's a quote by Albert Einstein, talking about the importance of this transcendent feeling, this feeling of transcendence. Ramachandran begins by telling a little story about a researcher named Michael Persinger, who used this thing called a transcranial magnetic stimulator. Today, these things are pretty common. When Ramachandran was writing this, they were not as well known or as common as they are now in psychology. So this is actually a magnetic wave that stimulates a surface area of the brain. So he begins, here's a quote from the text: "When the Canadian psychologist Dr. Michael Persinger got hold of a similar device a few years ago, He chose instead to stimulate parts of his own temporal lobes, and he found to his amazement that he experienced God for the first time in his life. Firstly, let me tell you, throughout the history, as you may or may not know, my specialty is the history of science and the history of psychology. And I can report to you that this idea of doing experiments on yourself is not new in psychology. A lot of psychologists, James McKean Cattell, they all experimented with hallucinogens, with various types of substances and drugs, etc. Hypnotism. This is nothing new in psychology. I would say that the most interesting of the psychologists I've read are the ones who have tried stuff themselves on themselves, gone, to the shamans and whatnot. So he continues. I first heard about Dr. Persinger's strange experiments from my colleague, Patricia Churchland, who spotted an account of it in a popular Canadian science magazine. She phoned me right away. Rama, you're not going to believe this. There's a man in Canada who stimulated his temporal lobe and experienced God. What do you make of it? So Ramachandra goes on to say, Dr. Persinger's observation was not a complete surprise, as I have always suspected that the temporal lobes, especially the left temporal lobe, is somehow involved in religious experience. Every medical student is taught that patients with epileptic seizures originating in this part of the brain can have intense spiritual experiences during the seizures and sometimes become preoccupied with religious and moral issues even during the seizure-free or interrectal periods. But does this syndrome imply that our brains contain some sort of circuitry that is actually specialized for religious experience, he asks. Is there a, quote, God module in our heads? Here's his answer. And if such a circuit exists, where did it come from? Could it be a product of natural selection, a human trait as natural in the biological sense as language or the stereoscopic vision? Or is there a deeper mystery at play, as a philosopher, epistemologist, and theologian might argue? He asks, where do these so what he's saying here is, of course, that he's asking big questions. If we have this area of the brain that seems to be a part of the religious experience, what do we conclude from that? Does that automatically mean that the biology is causing the religious experience? Does it mean that religious belief has some sort of evolutionary advantage? Does it mean that the designer, God, if there's a creator, that he created this aspect of the brain? I mean, what is this? What does this mean? And he leaves this open. He leaves this question open. The question will remain open. He says, but where do such feelings come from? It may be that any intelligent, sentient being that can look into his own future and confront his own mortality will sooner or later begin to engage in such disquieting ruminations. Does my little life have any real significance in the grand scheme of things? Is my father's sperm, if my father's sperm had not fertilized that particular egg on that fateful night, would I not have existed? And in what real sense, then, would the universe have existed? Would it not then, as Erwin Schrödinger said, have been a mere play before empty benches? And if my dad had coughed at the critical moment so that a different sperm had fertilized the ovum, our minds start reeling when pondering such possibilities. We are bedeviled by the paradox. On the one hand, our lives seem so important, with all those cherished, highly personal memories, and yet we know that in the cosmic scheme of things, our brief existence amounts to nothing at all. So how do people make sense of this dilemma? For many, the answer is straightforward. They seek solace in religion. But surely there is more to it than that. If religious beliefs are merely the combined result of wishful thinking and longing for immortality, How do you explain the flights of intense religious ecstasy experienced by patients with temporal lobe seizures, or their claim that God speaks directly to them? Many a patient has told me of a divine light that illuminates all things, or of an ultimate truth that lies completely beyond the reach of ordinary minds who are too immersed in the hustle and bustle of daily life to notice the beauty and grandeur of it all. Of course, they might simply be suffering from hallucinations and delusions of all kinds of schizophrenic might experience, but if that's the case, why do such hallucinations occur, mainly in the temporal lobes and when the temporal lobes are involved? Even more puzzling, why do they take this particular form? Why don't these patients hallucinate about pigs or donkeys? So he's asking all kind of very philosophical questions. I just want to point out to you here, we're talking now about a biological psychologist, a neurologist who's researching in brain activity of religious experience. But hopefully you're seeing now why I selected him for you to study first in this, because he's not merely saying this area of the brain is correlated with this. He's asking penetrating questions. He's saying, hey, there's a lot to this. Let's not overstate what we might think we know from reverse inference. The fact that the temporal lobe is active in religious experience opens up more questions rather than solving any or answering too many. So I've selected these quotes because they're giving you a flavor of not only his thinking, but how he's thinking and his approach to doing psychology. Like I said, he's a role model for us. He goes on in another paragraph to say the famous French neurologist Pierre-Paul Broca, Broca's area for speech production, has named this structure in the limbic system. Because rabies patients suffered violent emotional fits, Pappas reasoned that these limbic structures must be intimately involved in human emotional behavior. Okay, so I subtracted this from another paragraph. They're identified, we're now drawing in the limbic system. If you remember the limbic system from chapter 1, the limbic system is the area directly in the subcortex, in the inner brain, directly where the forehead is, but back in. And its limbic system has a lot of emotional, also long-term memory is processed in the limbic system. The limbic system gets its input from all sensory systems, from vision, touch, hearing, taste, and smell. It's often it's called the midbrain. It's kind of like an integration area for all the senses. Limbic system gets its input from all the senses. The latter sense is, in fact, directly wired to limbic system. So smell is directly part of the limbic system. So smell, emotion, and long-term memory. Very interesting to think about the correlations of those three things. I'm getting killed by mosquitoes out here. Good news for you, and it's going to be a shorter lecture. So the limbic system gets its input from all the senses, and particularly the smell. The amygdala is an almond-shaped structure that serves as a gateway into the limbic system. It is hardly surprising, given that in lower mammals, smell is intimately linked with emotion, territorial behavior, aggression, and sexuality. Smell has a lot of research in psychoanalytic literature. Smell and sexual desire, scent and sexual desire, also evolutionary psychology. The limbic system's output, as Pappas realized, is geared mainly towards the experience and expression of emotions. The experience of emotions is mediated by a back and forth connection with the frontal lobes. So, and much of the richness in our inner emotional life probably depends on these interactions. So if you can imagine, the limbic system is emotional experience, frontal lobes are personality, wisdom, logic, rationality, reasoning, all that stuff. So there's this communication between the highly emotional, impulsive feelings and the processing and understanding of those feelings, frontal lobes. The outward expression of these emotions, on the other hand, requires the participation of small clusters of densely packed cells called the hypothalamus, a control center with three major outputs of its own. First, the hypothalamic nuclei send hormonal and neural signals to the pituitary gland, which is often described as the conductor of the endocrine system. Keep in mind that all of the hormones on the endocrine system are the exact same chemicals as neurotransmitters. It's the only distinction we make in referring to them as a hormone or as a neurotransmitter depends upon how they're functioning. So if the chemical substance is being discharged from one neuron to another neuron, we call it a neurotransmitter. And if that same chemical is being distributed through the bloodstream, we call it a hormone. First, the hypothalamic nuclei send hormonal and neural signals to the pituitary gland, which is often described as the conductor of the endocrine system. Hormones released through this system influence almost every part of the human body, a biological tour de force we shall consider in the analysis of the mind-body interaction in Chapter 11. Second, the hypothalamus sends commands to the autonomic nervous system, which controls various vegetative or bodily functions, including production of tears, saliva, sweat, blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature, respiration, bladder function, defecation, and so on. So basic functions in the of the autonomic nervous system. Remember, that's fight or flight, flight, or freeze. Now we're referring to this as. The hypothalamus can be regarded as the brain of this archaic ancillary nervous system. Why is he calling it archaic ancillary nervous system? Because it is evolutionarily older. It's evolved before frontal lobe frontal lobes evolved. The third output drives actual behaviors, often remembered by the mnemonic, the 4 F's. Fighting, fleeing, feeding, and sexual behavior. I usually hear this talked as fighting, fleeing, feeding, and fornicating. In short, the hypothalamus is the body's survival center, preparing the body for dire emergencies or sometimes for the passing on of its genes. So survival and passing on of genes. The hypothalamus is a very important area of the brain in discussing evolutionary psychology. So let's think about what we're having going on here. We're having left temporal lobe seizures, activity in temporal lobes. We're having activity in the limbic system, and specifically in the limbic system, the hypothalamus, which is a very primal kind of drive area for survival and for sexual reproduction. Ramachandran goes on much of our... I'm skipping through key paragraphs from the text. In case you're following in the book, I'm not going straight through the chapter. I selected paragraphs that I wanted to share with you and bring your attention to and explain in more detail. He goes on, much of our knowledge about the function of the limbic system comes from patients who have epileptic seizures originating in this part of the brain. When you hear the word epilepsy, you usually think of someone having fits or a seizure. The powerful involuntary contractions of all muscles of the body and falling to the ground. Indeed, these symptoms characterize the most well-known forms of epilepsy, called grand mal seizures. Such seizures usually arise because a tiny cluster of neurons somewhere in the brain is misbehaving, firing chaotically until activity spreads like wildfire to engulf the entire brain. But seizures can also be focal. That is, they can remain confined largely to a single small patch in the brain. If such focal seizures are mainly in the motor cortex, the result is a sequential march of muscle twitching, or the so-called Jacksonian seizures. If they happen to be in the limbic system, then the most striking symptoms are emotional. Patients say that their feelings are on fire, ranging from intense ecstasy to profound despair, a sense of impending doom, or even fits of extreme rage and terror. Women sometimes experience orgasms during the seizures, although for some obscure reason, men never do. But most remarkable of all are those patients who have deeply moving spiritual experiences, including the feeling of divine presence and the sense that they are in direct communion with God. So what he's talking about here is we can have seizures. So epileptic patients can have seizures. And if the area of the brain that the brain is seizuring in, if that area is a motor area, the seizure is experienced muscularly, shaking, trembling, falling on the ground. If the area of the brain that goes into seizure has to do with emotions or sensory experience, the seizures produce hallucinations or produce profound emotional experiences. Everything around them is imbued with cosmic significance. Now, this is one of the classic characteristics of religious experience. It's funny, I'm out here having surfed all day, and something happens to some of us, when we get hooked on surfing. And there have been books and essays written. Dr. Timothy Leary, the famous Harvard psychologist who did the LSD experiments, wrote an entire essay on surfing. There's something, if you've ever done this, there's something about the first time a wave catches your board, and you get this, and you get up and you stand on this board, and even if it's just for a few seconds because balancing is difficult, a feeling that it transcends like a rush. It's not adrenaline. My experience was spiritual. The first time that a wave took my board and I stood up on it, it was almost like I was communing with some big force in the universe, surrendering to it, being a part of it, and also in a certain way managing it because you're riding the wave, you know. So it's funny because it was like all of a sudden this was a religious experience, it was spiritual. I don't want to say religious, it was spiritual experience. It was like suddenly everything had a different significance in life, in the world. It was like perspective came on. Things that were important. This is not uncommon with a lot of folks who take up surfing. It's very much like you hear people who have a religious transformation or a conversion and begin, going to some religious church service and devote their life to it. Something happened in my life where nothing else seemed to really matter as much as the pursuit of this union with the wave. I know this sounds funny, but there's some musicians have this as well. Improvisational musicians, jazz musicians. There's no music in front of you. You simply have to listen to these chord structures, and you use your ear, and you come in with your instrument, and you play, and you kind of like ride a musical wave. And it's very spontaneous, but that's what's being described here. When I read this, everything around them is imbued with cosmic significance. And it makes me wonder if, especially that first time, if I had been hooked up to some sort of imaging, were my temporal lobes and limbic system and temporal lobes, were they firing when I had this experience of oneness with the water, with the wave, with this big, massive structure? Think in French, la mer, the sea, is the same word as for the mother. Freud described the unconscious as an oceanic feeling. Being in the womb is often compared to an oceanic, being surrounded in oceanic saline, or salt water. Okay, I'll stop. We'll go on. But this idea, everything around them is imbued with cosmic significance. If you've ever had a profound religious experience, whether it be with music, surfing, in your worship, your place of worship, synagogue, whatever it is, if you've experienced this, you know what this means. Suddenly everything realigns in its perspective. If you haven't experienced this, seek it out. I don't know how you seek it out. You just open yourself up to it, I guess. They may say, I finally understand what it's all about. This is the moment I've been waiting for all my life. Suddenly it all makes sense. Boy, I just can really relate to that. Or finally, I have the insight into the true nature of the cosmos. Oh, do you know who else experiences this? People who drop acid. Yeah, sacred mushrooms and the shamans or LSD. This is often the experience that people say after they've taken LSD or eaten the sacred mushroom, that their perspective on the world has changed forevermore. And we could say, is this a matter of the brain gets changed and so the world seems different, or is this a matter of the experience makes the world look different? What do I mean by that? If someone gets into a car accident and then they suffer depression, the depression could be a result of brain injury, or the depression could be a result of the experience of being in the car accident. You see, the brain, this is, the correlation is not the causation here, in other words. We have to keep that in mind. Truth is revealed at last. Should I derive from limbic structures concerned? I find it ironic that this sense of enlightenment, this absolute conviction that the truth has been revealed at last, should derive from limbic structures concerned with emotions rather than with thinking. Rational parts of the brain that take so much pride in their ability to discern the truth and the falsehood. So what he's saying is, this is remarkable. If you were an intuitive type person, so an intuitive type, as Carl Jung described it, is someone who privileges their gut feeling over any evidence. So someone who's a thinking versus thinking, perceiving, intuitive sensing. So if someone's sensing, they sense with their empirical knowledge, their eyes, their ears, and they take that as the and thinking as the criteria for what's valid in their lives. And those who are intuitive trust in their intuition despite what thinking and sensing tells them. And so what Ramachandran's saying here is he finds it interesting that this spiritual insight is something that has nothing to do with logic, has everything to do with emotions. And maybe that's the key to wisdom. Psychologists argue over what is wisdom. And as you know, wisdom, the qualities often have little to do with thinking and more to do with just a certain way of being in the world. One of the key aspects of wisdom is being comfortable with ambiguity, being comfortable with not knowing answers, being comfortable with mysteries rather than being comfortable with definite certainty. God has vouchsafed for us normal people only occasional glimpses of a deeper truth. For me, they can occur when listening to some especially moving passage of music, or when I look at Jupiter's moons or through a telescope. But these patients enjoy a unique privilege of gazing directly into God's eyes every time they have a seizure. Who is to say that whether such experiences are genuine, whatever that might mean, or pathological? Would you, the physician, really want to medicate such a patient and deny visitation rights to the Almighty? It's a very fascinating thing that he's bringing to our attention here. He's asking us, as a physician, do you medicate someone who is having profound religious, spiritual insights. These changes, he says, these changes give rise to what some neurologists have called temporal lobe personality. Patients have heightened emotions and see cosmic significance in trivial events. It is claimed that they tend to be humorless, full of self-importance, and to maintain elaborate diaries that record quotidian events in elaborate detail. The trait called hypergraphia, that's writing, a lot of writing. Patients have on occasion given me hundreds of pages of written text filled with mystical symbols and notations. Some of these patients are sticky in conversation, argumentative and pedantic and egocentric, although less so than many of my scientific colleagues. There's a dig he just made at his own scientific colleagues. And they obsessively preoccupied with philosophical issues and theological issues. So much going on in this. He's describing a certain personality type that almost becomes like a guru after an experience, and their certainty is beyond belief, and it transcends into knowing. And I think this is where dogmatism takes place. And what he's saying is, be careful if you're a scientist reading this and you think you're aloof from this kind of behavior, because he said many of his own scientific colleagues are equally as dogmatic in their scientific beliefs. I tell you, Ramachandran is a really ethical thinker. He never is disparaging of belief systems outside of his own. He seems to always make room and maintain intellectual humility and even an ethical kindness in his gentleness. Kindness isn't the word, gentleness and sensitivity in his approach. He doesn't feel the need to put other systems of knowledge down in order to justify the one from which he's writing from. I would like you to concentrate on the example of Paul. Paul is the individual who has the mystical religious experiences. It's his main case study in this chapter. So I'm not going to go through this. But Paul, I'm going to let you read this. But I think that you should read that. I just heard a raccoon. Let's the third. I want to show you. Okay, so read about Paul, and then he asks, why do patients like Paul have religious experiences? I can think of 4 possibilities. This is important. Here is 4 possibilities of why these religious experiences are taking place after a seizure in the temporal lobes. Paul is a temporal lobe patient. Temporal lobe epilepsy, who has religious experiences. One of the reasons, here are the 4 explanations he can give of why a temporal lobe epilepsy causes religious experience. One is that God really does visit these people. That's an explanation. If that's true, so be it, he says. Who are we to question God's infinite wisdom? Unfortunately, this can be neither proved nor ruled out on empirical grounds. So he says it is possible, but we can't prove it and we can't rule it out, so let's just keep it as one of the 4 possibilities. The second possibility is that because these patients have experienced all sorts of odd, inexplicable emotions, as if a cauldron had boiled over, perhaps their only recourse is to seek ablution in the calm waters of religious tranquility, or the emotional hodgepodge may be misinterpreted as mystical messages from another world. I find this latter explanation unlikely for 2 reasons. Firstly, there are other neurological and psychiatric disorders such as frontal lobe syndrome and schizophrenia and manic depressive illness, or just depression in which emotions are disturbed, but one rarely sees religious preoccupations. So, in other words, to say that this is a way of, like, the symptoms are a way of having some sort of religious comfort, that religion is a comfort from whatever symptoms are taking place. He said this would happen also with other forms of brain abnormalities and seizures, and it doesn't. Even though the schizophrenics might occasionally talk about God, the feelings are usually fleeting. They don't have the same intense fervor of the obsessive and stereotyped quality that one sees in the temporal lobe epileptics. So hence emotional changes alone cannot provide the complete explanation for the religious preoccupation. Third possibility, this third explanation invokes connections between sensory centers, vision and hearing, the amygdala, and parts of the limbic system specialized in recognizing the emotional significance of events in the world. Obviously, not every person or event you encounter throughout a typical day sets off alarm bells. That would be maladaptive, and you'd soon go mad. To cope with the world's uncertainties, you need a way of gauging the salience of events before you relay a message to the rest of the limbic system and to the hypothalamus, telling them to assist you in fighting or fleeing. But consider what might happen if spurious signals stemming from limbic seizures, the seizure activity, were to travel these pathways. You get the sort of kindling I described earlier. Kindling is when certain neural pathways spark and then become more bundled after the initial firing. They become it becomes stronger. That's called kindling. These salience pathways, they become structured pathways that then become more likely way of experiences. These pathways would become strengthened, increased communications between brain structures, sensory brain areas that see people and events and hear voices and noises would become more closely linked to emotional centers. The result, every object and event, not just salient ones, would become imbued with deep significance to that patient. So this is also an explanation that doesn't work out, the idea that somehow these things become connected, the sensory and the experience and the emotions become connected. He said that this is alone doesn't explain things, because that would mean that through the process everything would suddenly have religious significance, and that's not the case. The transcendent experience, you see connections between the universe, but not every single thing takes on cosmic sensations. So the fourth hypothesis is even more speculative. Could it be that human beings have actually evolved specialized neural activity for the sole purpose of mediating religious experience? The human belief in supernatural is so widespread in all societies all over the world that it's tempting to ask whether the propensity for such beliefs might have a biological basis. If so, you'd have to answer a key question: what sorts of Darwinian selection pressures would lead to such a mechanism? And if there is such a mechanism, is there a gene or a set of genes concerned mainly with the religiosity and spiritual learning, a gene that atheists might lack or have learned to circumvent? And then he says, just kidding. He's not just kidding. You should remember, any argument that can be taken, it might sound very tempting to say, well, someone has a genetic predisposition towards religious belief, and dismiss it in that way. And it could, the answer could equally be someone has a genetic predisposition for scientific belief. It starts to lose its credibility at that point. Let's see here. Okay, we're running up to 40 minutes. I got so much more here I wanted to talk with you about. Boy, oh boy. There's just so much in this chapter. I want to, you're going to just have to really study the chapter and understand these connections between the limbic system, the temporal lobes, the emotion aspect of the limbic system, and the sensory integration. And then finally in the chapter, he said, see, he tries to draw this in with artistic experience, and it turns out that artistic experience, creativity and appreciation of art, has a lot to do with the same areas of the brain as the transcendental religious experience, which anyone who's an artist shouldn't find that surprising at all. He says, what's the bottom line? The one clear conclusion that emerges from all of this is that there are circuits in the human brain that are involved in religious experience, and these become hyperactive in some epileptics. We still don't know whether these circuits evolved specifically for religion, as evolutionary psychologists might argue, or whether they generate other emotions that are merely conducive to such beliefs, although that cannot explain the fervor in which the beliefs are held by many patients. We are therefore still a long way from showing that there is a God module. It's important in the brain that might be genetically specified. But to me, the exciting idea is that one can even begin to address questions about God and spirituality scientifically. So this is when he then goes on to discuss art. So soak up chapter 9. There's a lot going on in chapter 9. And this is great to be aware of, a whole new, very different from our humanistic Gordon Allport study of religious experience. It adds another perspective, another clue to the overall experience. And next week, when we begin the biology of belief, you're going to find another very interesting approach to biology, biological psychology, and spirituality. Okay, signing off from the Jersey Shore in the dunes. Have a nice week.